Inking and coloring your fantasy cityscape. My fantasy cityscape is not done yet, but I wanted to show you the technique. First of all, figure out where the light source is coming from and ink in only the shadow side of each object. Do not ink in the side facing the sun. By the way, do not add in a corner sun. You will destroy your picture if you have a corner sun. It'll make it look like a baby did it. Go in the direction that the three-dimensional objects are going in when you ink. I'm using a cross-hatching technique, so I'm following the three-dimensional forms in two different directions. It looks like little mini hashtags, but it'll make your artwork look more three-dimensional, and not outlining the part facing the sun is very important. It'll make the contrast greater, and it'll make the three-dimensional forms pop. If you outline everything, it's going to look flat. So just imagine the direction the three-dimensional forms are going in. If it's a curved object, then you use curved lines. If it's a flat object, you use straight lines. Notice on the person, I'm only inking in the part that's facing away from the sun, and I'm using lines in two different directions. I'm using heavier, bolder lines in the extreme foreground and more delicate, thinner lines in the middle ground and background. When you color, use the same thing. For the extreme foreground, you would use very bright, intense colors. I'm using watercolor pencils here. So what I'm doing is I'm coloring very lightly using the watercolor pencils, curving my lines around round objects, cross-hatching my lines, and using curved brush strokes around round objects as well when I add the water. I'm careful not to add too much water because this is just regular drawing paper, and I am not painting over any area that is already wet because I don't want to pill or rip the paper. When I paint the green in the extreme foreground, I want it to be very bright, like it's jumping out at you. Whereas when I paint the green in the background, I want it to be dull and faded, like it's fading off into the distance. So I'm coloring in the green in the foreground. I'm using yellow green where it's sunnier and a bluer green where it's more shaded. Making my pencil lines follow the curve of the planet. And then when I brush with water, I'm also making my paintbrush follow the curve of the planet and not using too much water so I don't buckle or pill the paper, or God forbid, rip it. When I go to the background, I also want a green planet. However, I don't want it to be as bright. Now, the opposite of green is red because yellow and blue make green, and the primary color left over is the opposite color, which is red. If I take a color and I mix it with its opposite, it will look duller. So I've got this green, and I'm now mixing it with red so that when it's farther away, it looks duller, like it's fading off into the distance. But it still needs to look green, just not as bright a green. So I'm taking my light green, coloring over it very lightly with red, and then with a little more green again. So it's still going to be green, but it's going to be duller than if it were in the extreme foreground. And you're going to see the difference in color. It's still green, but that little bit of red I added to it allows it to fade off into the distance. The other thing is I've desaturated my color by drawing very lightly with the green and the orange. If I go too dark, it's going to pop out and jump out at me. So I've colored very lightly, and I've added a little bit of red to dull down the green. And you're going to see when you pan out that the green planet far away is much duller than the green planet up close. Now in the middle ground, I'm going to create a blue planet. However, I don't want it to be a bright blue that jumps out at you. I want it to be a dull, far away blue. So the opposite of blue is orange because primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Red and yellow make orange, and blue is the color that's left over. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my blue planet, but I'm going to add just a tiny bit of orange into it. Not so much that it stops being blue and turns brown, but just enough to dull down the blue so it looks far away. And the other thing that I'm doing is notice I'm very carefully coloring lightly. I'm not pressing hard with the blue because I want it to look like it's fading off into the distance. So I'm doing a lot of blue very lightly and some orange lightly mixed right into the blue. And you'll see what happens when I use my paintbrush and blend the colors. It still looks blue, but it looks like a dull and faded blue. Notice that when I get my paper wet, I do not go over it with pencil again. I let it dry first. If there's anything I don't like about the color, I just go ahead and let it dry and then add more color later. I'm not done with my painting, but you can see how adding duller colors in the background and brighter colors in the foreground helps make my picture look more three-dimensional. Adding finer lines in the background and heavier lines in the foreground also makes my picture look three-dimensional, as well as only inking in the shadow side of each object and following the direction of the three-dimensional form, both when inking and coloring. Using these techniques will cause your foreground to pop and your background to recede.